Hello everyone and welcome to the 5th episode of the Discord.net bot development series. In this episode it's time to talk a bit more about analyzers and coding conventions. Keep in mind that this tutorial will not be focusing a lot on Discord.net per se. We're not going to add some really interesting new features to our bot, but this is more about making our code more readable for everyone that might use it in the future, which might be really convenient to do if you're going to work on open source projects, but also closed source projects where you're going to share code with other people. This episode may also be a bit shorter than other episodes, since this will be a bit more about how can we make our code more readable to other people and how can we make sure that we are sticking to the coding conventions that have been agreed upon. First, what are coding conventions? If we go to our browser, I have opened up a page that will be in the description down below, made by Microsoft, that goes a bit more in depth about coding conventions. What they ensure is that our code has a consistent look everywhere. This means that when you stick to the coding conventions, the way that the code is written, for instance, when we use case sensitivity, how we name some variables and related, will all be consistent across projects. There's also a few things that Microsoft say about it over here. Coding conventions serve the following purposes. They create a consistent look to the code so that readers can focus on content, not the layout. They enable readers to understand the code more quickly by making assumptions based on previous experience. They facilitate copying, changing, and maintaining the code, and they demonstrate C# best practices. So this is even about some best practices that you can do in C#. If we read down, there's a few things that we can go through. Naming conventions, layout conventions, commenting conventions, and language guidelines. This means that for each part, we have separate conventions. But to write code and constantly have this page open and to check every single small thing if you're meeting those conventions, that might be a bit difficult. And it's also quite inefficient because you would be spending more time on making sure you're following these conventions than actually programming, and that's not really what you want. To help us with that, there exists something that's called analyzers. One of the analyzers that we're going to use will be StyleCop.analyzers. It's one of the most popular analyzers for C# and really make sure that we are meeting all of the conventions that are described in, for instance, this document. Let's take a look. If we head to Visual Studio and we head to Tools and NuGet Package Manager and Manage NuGet Packages for Solution, we can then here search for StyleCop.analyzers. In here, there's a library that we can use which has 43.1 million downloads and is made by Sam Harwell. Press the library, make sure you selected your project over here, and install the latest stable version. When it's done, you will see that a lot of warnings will pop up. That's good. It means that it's working, and that means that our analyzer is actually checking our code and is checking if we are in compliance with the coding conventions. Let's start by taking a look at our program.cs. Let's go all the way up and we will see a lot of green underlined parts. If we hover over the first part, it will say that using directive should appear within a namespace declaration. This means that we should move this part inside our namespace. Now, you could do this manually by copying this part over to here, or you could hover over this part, press the light bulb and say reorder using statements, which will not only put all the using statements over here, but it will also sort them alphabetically. You might say, hey, but the S does not come before the D. That's true. This is because all system using directives actually appear above all other using directives. So the system using directives are the only exception to the sorting. Now, there's still a very small part that's underlined at the top of our file. It says the file header is missing or not located at the top of the file. Say you're working on a closed source project. In that case, it might be nice to have a copyright mention or disclaimer at the top of your file. This analyzer actually allows you to do that. If you press on a light bulb, it will give you an option to say add file header, which will paste a nice copyright header over here. But since this project is open source, and we don't really have any copyright on this, I will get rid of this part. But now you might say, won't that warning come back again? That's true. You're also able to actually suppress warnings and say like, hey, we have a good reason not to do this. To do so, you hover over the part that has a warning, you press the light bulb, and you say suppress or configure issues. As you can see, if we head back here, the error associated with this problem is SA1633. So if we go back to the light bulb, suppress or configure issues, we can suppress or configure that very SA1633 error, or in this case, warning. Now it gives you two options. You can either adjust this in the source, which will then allow us to disable this warning within this file, or we could use the suppression file, which will disable this warning over the entire project or some targets that we specify. Press on in suppression file. This will create a global suppressions file where we can define some of the warnings that we do not want to see. A nice thing here is that you can also give a justification as per why you do not want this to be here. So here we can just say, project does not have copyright, licensed as MIT. You can also define a scope and a target. You can also get rid of those two and just keep the justification, which will just disable this warning entirely, regardless of where, which might be nice. If we go back to the program.cs, the next warning that we get is at the class. There's two warnings actually here. SA1600 saying elements should be documented, and SA1400, the element program should declare an access modifier. The first warning says, hey, you need to document each element, and in this case, that's a class. This is nice because in the future, someone might not understand exactly what the purpose is of this class. Now, of course, for a program class, it's the entry point of your application, so that might be easy to explain. But this general class, what does that do? So for here, what we will just say is we will create a comment, and we do this by pressing the / 3 times. And here we can now give a summary, just like with commands, for instance. But as a summary, we can explain like, hey, what's the purpose of this class? So we will say the entry point of the bot, just like that. The next thing that we have is that we need to declare an access modifier for our program class. We can do this by either providing one in front of it, or we can go and hover over it, press on the light bulb, and say declare accessibility, which will then add internal in front of class, which will then declare the access modifier of program to be internal. The next warning that we see is main. This main method should declare again an access modifier, and we will set the access modifier to private. Now we check our file, make sure there are no warnings in it, and that means we are now in compliance with the coding conventions. There's also one final thing that you can do, which is if you click on all of the using directives and you press on the light bulb, you can get rid of all unnecessary using statements, like the system using directive that we had at the top. And now our file is really clean and in compliance with all the coding conventions. The next file that we will take a look at is the general class. Again, because we want these using directives to be under the namespace, we press the light bulb and say reorder using statements, which will again put them in alphabetical order, plus move them inside our namespace. We can then get rid of the using directives that are not used, and then we have a warning at general, which will tell us that, hey, you need to document this element. So we use 3 / and we say the general module containing commands like ping. Of course, you can just pick your own description, but this is a more general description that I am using, but you could use a completely different one, and you should also use a different one when you're working on a different module. The next warning appears here, because the ping method also needs to be documented. So we pressed on a light bulb, and we'll say generate method documentation. Now in here, we can define the summary, and now we can just say a command that will respond with Pong. Just like that. And now we have a summary for this command. This also means that if you now hover over ping async, we will see here that there's a nice description of this method. It says a command that will respond with Pong. It's pretty nice. If you hover over general, you will see the same happening. You will now see an actual description appearing over here. Really nice. The next warnings appear at context. It says prefix local calls with this. Let's do that. Hover over the light bulb, press it and say prefix reference with this. Now a nice thing that you can do here is you can choose to apply this over the entire file. You do this by simply saying fix all occurrences in document and then press apply, which will fix this warning over the entire file in just a few clicks. Now we go to the info async method, we press the light bulb and we say generate method documentation. Here we say a command to get some information about a user. And now we can explain why there needs to be this socketGoToUser parameter. So we will just explain it. We will say an optional user to get the information from. Now, if we hover over the info async command, you will see the description, a command to get some information about a user. And say, for instance, if we were here and we would say info async, then we would also get an explanation about this socketGoToUser over here. You see socketGoToUser, an optional user to get the information from, which is the very description that we have defined over here. I will now also get rid of line 23 as it's no longer necessary and we just have this simple ping command. The next file that we will take a look at is the command handler over here. We go all the way up top, we hover over these warnings, and if the light bulb does not appear, you can always choose to press Ctrl and then say reorder using statements. Now if we go to the light bulb again, we'll also say remove unnecessary using directives, and then we will have a warning at the command handler. We create a new comment and we say the class responsible for handling the commands and various events. Now if you hover over command handler, you'll see the very description standing over there. The command handler is also the only class that has a constructor, and constructors have their own documentation as well. Hover over command handler over here, press the light bulb and say generate constructor documentation. Here we need to provide a description of each of the elements that we inject. So for the provider, we will say the, and what we can then do is we can refer to, for instance, a type. We do this by saying a arrow to the left, C, then press tab, and then we say I service provider, so referring to the type like this, and then we say that should be injected. Now, if you hover over the provider, you will see that it makes it nicely green, just like the interface type over here. So now it says the I service provider that should be injected. For the client, we will do the same, D, and then arrow to the left, C, tab, and then we say Discord socket client that should be injected. For the command service, we say the C command service that should be injected. And for the I configuration, we say the I configuration that should be injected. Just like that. Now, if we go a bit more down, we have the initialize async task. Now, because the initialize async task comes from initialize service, which the command handler inherits from, we can actually go to the light bulb and say inherit documentation. And in this case, if we hover over it again, it just copies the explanation of this method from the initialize service. Because if we go in here and we open up this one, you can see the summary of the initialize async method, which if we go back to the command handler, we can see again over here. We also have two warnings over here because we again need to prefix these methods with the DESC. So let's do that again. And then if we go a bit more down, we again have two warnings. Braces should not be omitted. Basically meaning that if we press on a light bulb, it will add back the curly brackets that we actually emitted over there. And we'll do the same over here. And we'll do the same over here. And now there are 0 warnings, meaning that we are now in compliance with the coding conventions. This is pretty nice. Now before we end this episode, I will quickly show you how to configure the file header, for instance if you're working on a closed source project. To do so, we simply get rid of the global suppressions file by right-clicking it, pressing delete and pressing OK. And then we go, for instance, to this namespace over here. We press the light bulb and we say add StyleCop settings to the project. This will create a new file called stylecop.json, and in here we can define the name of our company. We'll just say coding with FHAM. Then we go back to the command handler. We go to the namespace over here, press the light bulb, and you'll see that the warning still appears. That's weird. That's because we skipped a small part at the very top of this file. Because we need to do something so that this file is actually being used by the analyzer. To do this, we simply right-click the stylecop.json file, press properties, go all the way down to build action, and we select here C# analyzer additional file. You might ask, why do we need to do this? This is because this file is actually part of a NuGet package. Therefore, sometimes you need to manually add some other things because it's not something like a plugin. Therefore, we have to specify the build action like this. Now, if we go back to, for instance, the command handler, we will see the warnings again. We press the light bulb and say add file header, which will then nicely add the header over here. And now you can apply the same to the program.cs and general.cs. I will for now just get rid of the file headers again, delete the stylecop.json file, and tell my program to suppress this very warning by going to suppress or configure issues and suppress SA1633 in a suppression file, going to the file and saying in a justification, not needed as project is licensed under MIT, and we get rid of both the scope as well as the target. Now, if we close general.cs, command handler, and the program.cs and reopen them one by one, you will see that the warnings will disappear and that now our code is fully in compliance with the coding conventions. Just to make sure everything is still working, we launch the bot, head over to Discord and run our ping command. And as you can see, it still works perfectly fine. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and that it makes a bit more sense about what coding conventions and analyzers are. You will also see that some packages like Discord.net also have their own analyzers. If you want to, definitely check them out because they can be very interesting and tell you some techniques that you don't even know yet. Before we end this episode, I would like to thank everyone that has become part of our Patreon page in these last couple of days. We have reached our 2 goals. The first one of 5 patrons where we would start doing live streams and coding nights, and the second one of 10 patrons where we will go through ASP.NET Core and create our own web dashboard for our Discord bot, which we are developing right now, Watermelon. If you haven't already, take a look at our Patreon page and become part of our patrons. And, as of course one of the benefits of becoming a patron is the shoutouts, I would like to say a special thank you to Jason Thompson, Run Free, Steve Mods, Jay Freeb, Paintballer 007, Femduck, Kyle, Takashi89, Malali von Pelt, and Nicholas Barclay. Thank you everyone for becoming a patron. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I hope to see you in the next one.